we can move on to the sort of more advanced policies that I could think of. So let's switch this up a bit. I'm going to do this in red because red is the color of danger. Advanced macro policies, and I wouldn't necessarily say these are actually more difficult. Oop. One more? No. All right. I wouldn't actually say these are more difficult, but the topics that are required to understand them are more difficult. So we have. Hopefully we'll write that down again. I will hopefully be able to do videos today. I'm still sorting out the ones from last week. With this backup computer should be all right. So for our advanced macro policies, I think I'm just going to do this as a list because it doesn't really divide as nicely into separate categories. So we have exchange rate policy. We have, and this is really not for countries that have a floating exchange rate. Like if you have a floating exchange rate, technically that means you don't have an exchange rate policy. But again, you'll cover this when you cover exchange rates. Then we have protectionism, which you might have started or discussed already in some detail. And that's basically when you're using policies to restrict imports from other countries, protect your domestic industries. We have financial market regulation, which is possibly one of the most feared and dreaded topics in macroeconomics. I think it's not the hardest part of financial markets, in my opinion, which is quite a tricky topic, but I don't think the regulation part is that bad. And then you have policies for economic development. And this one of my favorite topics. This is specifically in the context of less economically developed countries or LEDCs. So this it could be things that are very specific to the context of these countries. For example, a policy called microfinance, which is providing small-scale banking services to households in poorer countries. There is no need for such a policy in somewhere like the UK because we already have a very well-established financial industry. So it's literally, there might be very specific policies which are only relevant to the context of development. Now, what I want to say about these to avoid future confusion for you guys again and to help you apply your policies knowledge to exam questions, if you get exam questions on these topics here, you do not really need to use the demand supply side policy categorization. Okay, so if you get a policy on financial market regulation, for example, that's going to be effectively a completely different set of policies. They might all be classed as supply side policies, but the point is it's unimportant. If you get if you get an essay on financial market regulation or financial market intervention, you don't really need to mention the term supply side or demand side policy at all. And students often make that mistake of thinking like policies is just demand and supply side policies. But it's not quite that simple. Again, like if you're doing policies for economic development, for example, microfinance is hard to classify as either a supply demand side policy. And again, I just wouldn't. I would just talk about microfinance as its own policy. But some of the policies for development are effectively just supply side policies, like education investment is a massive policy for development, and it's also a supply side policy. Again, if I was doing an essay on development, I wouldn't say you'd have to call it a supply side policy. In fact, the key thing you need to be able to do would be explain how it increases economic development, not just how it increases aggregate supply and say economic growth. So there is an extra bit of detail you have to use for this essay. Same for protectionism. Like some of the policies in protectionism are supply side or demand side. Some are difficult to classify, but if you did an essay on protectionism, you don't have to split it into demand and supply side. You don't have to classify them as demand and supply side policies. So you can kind of think of these as slightly separate essays. But very, very important to mention. Very important to mention. I'm not saying don't use ADAS diagrams. I'm not even necessarily saying don't call them supply demand side policies if there is overlap there. I'm just saying you don't have to. You can do an essay on protectionism very well without mentioning the term demand side or supply side. Same for exchange rates, same for all of this. So hopefully that gives you a bit of clarity in how you're going to apply these. And again, I just want to make sure it's easy for you guys to avoid a common problem of the overlap between all these different policies becoming really confusing. And then you're sort of you get an essay on protectionism, and instead of doing what they're looking for, which is you explain in detail how policies like tariffs and export subsidies affect the consumption of imports and affect things like the trade deficit. Instead, you go into demand and supply side policies because you see the word policies and you immediately think demand and supply side policies. So, okay, again, any questions on this, stick them in the chat, let me know. I'll give it 30 seconds or so. Otherwise, we will move on